Today I'm going to be making my very own mask. Now the masks that I've had, I bought at the store. They're kind of plain and boring, although they do keep us safe. So I'm going to be creating my own mask to keep me safe and others safe when I'm in public this summer. And especially because I am so excited to get back to Disney World this summer. I am an annual pass holder, but I want to make sure that I'm safe and it's required to wear a mask anyway. So I'm going to be using some leftover fabric that I have from different things I've sewn. I've made skirts and dresses out of these Disney fabrics. If you have any kind of fabric, you can do this project. You can use an old t-shirt, you could use an old bathing suit, any kind of fabric that you have that's going to be breathable and not too thick. So any soft, breathable fabric that's going to keep you safe is a good idea. Make sure that you ask parent permission before doing this project. This is a little bit advanced because you will be sewing today. Now this sewing is very basic, it's simple. I'm going to go through the directions with you step by step. What you're going to need is some scissors, that fabric. Of course, you're also going to need a needle for that thread. All right, now that I have my fabric, my scissors, my needle, and my thread, I'm all ready to get going.
The very first thing I'm going to do is get a plate. Now, if you're making a mask for a child, you should have that plate's diameter about 8 inches, but if you're making an adult mask, it should be about 10 inches. Then I'm going to trace my plate on my fabric. Now, ideally, I would have traced it with my marker on the back of the fabric, but you live and you learn. Then I'm going to use fabric scissors or good scissors to cut out my circle. Then I'm going to fold that circle in half and in half again, so quarters. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut the sides so that I'm making all separate pieces. On this side, it's double layered, so I make sure to cut through both of them. So you'll see I have one layer on the top and then that second bottom layer, making sure I cut all of it. That way I'm gonna end up with 4 separate pieces of my circle, those quarters. Now I'm going to have the front side of each facing each other. So I'm doing front to front, which is going to leave me seeing the backs. So I'm going to do a stitch along the arches on both of these pieces. I'm going to thread my needle. It doesn't matter what color thread you use. I'm just using black so that you can see it well, because it's a little tricky to see since I'm working with such small materials. I'm going to thread my needle. After I do, I'm going to pull it long, probably about 2 arms lengths. And then I'm going to double it up. I like to do that so it's nice and strong, and also double knot it. Double knotting can be tricky if you are a student trying to do this, so if you need to rewatch that part, it just takes some practice too. Now after I thread my needle and I make sure it's double knotted at the very end and pull tight, now I can go ahead and put my needle through my fabric on the very end there. I'm going to make sure that the tail end, or the one with the knot, is going to be on the reverse side of the fabric. That way I don't see it on the other side. Now I'm going to make sure that I knot my very first stitch by going back through and looping it. That way it's just knotted there securely, and then I can do a normal running stitch. A running stitch is just when you go over and under, over and under. You're basically just going from the front of the fabric to the back of the fabric and then back through. Now a really fast way to do this is if you just put that needle over, under, just like when you're weaving. It's going to be a lot faster than actually going down through the fabric and back up through the fabric. Also, this way you get a much straighter stitch as you're going along. Not that it matters though, because this is going to be not showing. It's going to be on the inside of the mask. That's why the fabric is reversed, so it really doesn't matter. This is going to take some time, especially if you've never done it before. Once I get to the end of this arch part, I'm going to stop sewing and I'm going to tie it off. So what that means is I always go around back through my last stitch and pull it tight in a knot and maybe pull it again. All right, so now it's looking more like a mask. I'm going to go ahead and repeat the same process because my thread got really short, so now I need to thread it again. And plus, it's not a good idea to have your thread too long because it can get tangled up and knotted, and it's just really a pain to work with. So you always want to work with just the right amount. So I'm threading it again, going through that whole process. Again, practice makes perfect. It takes a lot of practice. So I get to practice again on my other side. Now, if you make a mistake, first of all, it's totally okay, but you could also pull out your thread. You can always redo this, especially if you have a whole spool of thread. It really doesn't matter as long as you aren't wasting your materials that you have. All right, so I'm doing that same process where I'm kind of weaving over, under, and when I get to the end of my needle, I pull it through, making sure that my stitch is as straight as possible and as close to the edge. This is going to matter to make sure that the mask is fitted and it's the right shape. All right, now that I'm almost at the end, I'm going to go ahead and tie it off by going through my last stitch and tying a knot there. And then I can go ahead and cut my excess thread and save that needle for my next step. I might have enough thread on it, who knows? All right, so after I cut it off, now I'm gonna flip that mask inside out and see what it looks like. Now, just like I started at the beginning, I'm going to make sure that I take both of these pieces and put them front side to front side. If your fabric has a front and back, it's going to be important that you're placing these with both front sides together. Even if it doesn't have a front and back, it's going to be important, that way you don't see your stitch. Right now, you should see your stitches. All right, so I'm using pins to hold this in place because I'm noticing that this mask is going to be tricky to keep exactly together. It is important to try your best to keep it together, but to help that, I'm going to go ahead and pin it. When you're pinning something, if you haven't done it before, it's very similar to how I just was moving my needle over and under, except for I leave it there. I'm going to make sure that my pin is not too close to the edge because that's where I'm going to want to sew. So I'm putting the needle either on either side of where I'm going to do my running stitch. Now I'm going to make my stitch. Now this time my thread is extra long because I'm going to be going all the way around the mask. So this is going to be the longest part of this mask making process, and you have to be patient. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward the video as much as I possibly can because this is going to be the longest part that you just gotta hang in there for. So when you're threading your needle and getting ready for this part, just make sure that you have enough thread because if you run out, it is kind of a pain to tie more on, but it is possible. All right, so you'll notice that when I finally get to the end of this, I'm actually going to stop before the end. About 1 or 2 inches before I reach my last starting stitch, I'm going to stop and tie it off and cut it off. The reason is because this is going to be the little hole where I'm going to use to turn it inside out. So if you stitch it all the way through, well, that's not good. You're gonna have to pull out your stitches because you need a little spot here where you can tuck it in, pull the rest through. Once you finally pull it through, it's going to take some adjusting to make sure that you push it out all the way so that you can see all of your beautiful stitches, because your stitches should be on the inside, so now you're seeing a nice neat seam after you turn it inside out. It's pretty cool. As long as that last inch that I left unstitched is going to be near the 2 edges of that ellipse shape, then you're okay. You don't have to stitch it back up because this is where I'm going to be folding each side over to make a running stitch so I can put the elastic through. Now, in order to do that, it's going to help to have an iron to just press things down and make sure the creases are nice. That way your mask doesn't get distorted after you start stitching this final part here. So it's going to make it look a lot nicer and uniform if you go ahead and press with a hot iron. Just be careful when you're using it, don't burn those fingers. I'm going to make a triangle on that edge there and I'm going to press it down. That way it's going to stay better for when I go ahead and stitch this part. I'm going to still put a pin in it just in case I don't want to lose it. Put aside that hot iron and I'm going to start stitching. Now when you're stitching this part, it's so important to make sure that you leave enough room for a little pocket. If you can't put your pinky inside of that part there, in between your stitch and the edge of the fabric, it's not going to be large enough to put your elastic through. Now it depends on what kind of elastic you're going to use, but I'm going to be using a headband and it's pretty thick, so I want to make sure that I leave enough room there. I'm sewing through several layers of fabric at this point, so you're going to want to check the other side every once in a while to make sure that this stitch is nice and straight, because this is actually going to be your most important stitch because you're going to see it from the front of your mask. So make sure you do your best job. It actually took me a couple tries. I had to use a seam remover right here and pull out my first stitch and do it again, and that's okay. Everyone makes mistakes. You'll notice that my second try, I'm actually going to be sewing on the front side of my mask, the part that's convex instead of concave. It sticks out. It's going to be the part that's on the outside of your face, and that's because I can see my stitch, I can see where I'm going, I can make sure I'm sewing in a straight line. But just be sure that you're not going too far in because you need to leave that pinky's length space of that little pocket to stick your finger in. All right, I'm going to repeat that on the other side, super speedy because I don't want to make you watch it 3 times in a row now. And bam, now I've got my mask ready to go. I'm going to use a headband and I'm going to cut it in half at the glued seam. That way I can put through elastic on both sides and tie it off for my ears. Now, if you don't want to tie it, or maybe it's not long enough to tie, you can glue it together. You could also sew it together. And if you have a knot, you can actually move that knot around so it's on the inside of that pocket there and you don't see the knots behind your ears. You could also use hair ties if you don't have a headband elastic, or you could just use elastic actually from the craft store or sewing store. anything is going to work, but I had hair ties and headbands lying around. I didn't have any elastic left. So I'm gonna go ahead and tie off both of these sides. Now, it's not in the video, but I moved it through so that that knot was hiding. Bam, I'm done. I think it looks pretty good. Now, I'm no expert, so I'm sure if you're watching this and you're a sewing expert, you're going to critique all of my mistakes. But remember, this video was just a simple, my first mask making experience that I decided to document, mistakes and all. And if you're a student trying this, please let me know, because I have a feeling this video might have been a little confusing. It's my first sewing demo video, and I'm kind of curious to see if any kids try it. All right, awesome artists, no matter what age you are, hope this was helpful.